Good evening and welcome to Face for the Newsfirst team. I'm Niresh Eliathambi. We are just hours away from the 1st of August when Donald Trump's new tariffs come into effect. So far, only about 10 countries plus the European Union have negotiated trade agreements. That's not very many. There are so many countries which have not been able to complete the negotiations, and tomorrow the new high tariffs come into effect. Of course, that's not the end of the story. The negotiations will continue, but the tariffs will apply. So, to discuss this and much more, we have Mr. Arshad Ismail, who is the Senior Research Lead at Frontier Research. Good evening and welcome, Arshad.
Good evening, Niresh.
Right. So, Arshad, let's be very clear. It's not the end. It is simply that tomorrow anything that's sent to the US is going to be hit with 30%.
Sure.
That's a lot better than the 44% we were initially hit with. Okay, right, but 30% is still high and it's not good. But our government is negotiating, so the negotiations will continue. There's no end, there's no cutoff to the negotiations. Even a month from now we may still be negotiating. So it's a process, and of course the process is to bring it down from 30. How confident should we be?
So in terms of, I think, this deal, right, I think one, bringing it down from 44 to 30 itself, I think is a bit of an achievement, because if you look at certain countries, they've not been able to do that as well.
Right.
So I think, like you said, negotiations do take time. I don't think it's something, even though Trump wanted 90 deals in 90 days, he's only got close to around a 10. So I think negotiations will take time. I think further negotiations, if I'm not mistaken, there was supposed to be a bit of a meeting happening this week as well, but there is no public data out yet on exactly what the terms of this meeting is. So we've been trying to offer multiple things. So we've been trying to remove the tariffs that we charge on US exports. We've been considering the imports of WTI crude oil there from US, but all of these are still in the initial stages. We're still negotiating. So I think maybe a possibility, right? Maybe we could bring it down to, let's say, around a 20-ish, but I'm not looking at an environment where it goes back to zero, because I think a good example is even if you take the UK. Now, UK is a country that has a trade surplus with the US has a trade surplus with the UK. So even in a fact like that, they still charge them a 10% tariff. Now, given most of the other countries having a deficit, I don't think we can even get close to that 10%, because we don't have a lot to offer as well, because we're a small country at the end of the day. So I think maybe a good number for someone like Sri Lanka could be at least coming close to the 20, but that's where it is right now.
Right, and just looking at the countries which have managed to sign trade agreements over the past 3 months or so, we have the European Union, which is of course 27 nations as one. So that is a big achievement. Having said that, the nations of Europe aren't too happy with the deal that they got. There has been significant criticism from France and from Germany, which are the two biggest economies in the European Union. Then Japan struck a trade agreement. The UK did, and then over in Asia, we have South Korea, Indonesia, Vietnam, Philippines, Pakistan. All of them managed to sign trade agreements. But I think it's safe to say that every country in the world is trying to negotiate. They've sent teams, they're trying. So it's a matter of you just can't negotiate with, there are 193 countries in the world, so you negotiate with 192. Of course, you take the EU as a bloc, but you just can't negotiate that fast. I don't think the US Department of Commerce has that many negotiators. So smaller countries like ours get sort of left on the back burner, don't we?
So I think in terms of, with all these deals, right? So it's got into around close to 10. When you look at these deals also a bit more in specific, I don't think every country is 100% happy with the deal that they've got right now. Even if you take, for example, Vietnam, which got a deal of 20%. So they were expecting to get a deal of around 11%. So until the last moment, until Trump comes out and announces it, even they were not sure of what the number could be. So just like that, right? Many countries aren't really happy now. Even if you like a country like UK. So they've got, I think, so far they've got the best deal, but they do have, US has a trade surplus at the end, so that's at 10%. But even if you look at UK, if you look at, there is a clause on the vehicles. So it's the first 100,000 motor vehicles that UK sends to the US is capped at that 10%. Anything above is at a 25%. So there are things like that as well. Now, even if you take the European Union, they're capped at 15, but there are certain commodities like steel, commodities like copper, there are specific other rates that are applicable. So I think despite these deals, not everyone is really happy. And again, I don't think these deals are final as well, because we've seen Trump do really crazy things out there. So the fact that, he's struck the deal, but what's to say that 1 month later he's going to come change things? So right. Even these deals right now aren't really, I would say, final.
Right. And you spoke of Vietnam, which got a 20% deal, but Vietnam in return has given a lot, 0% for US products into Vietnam, plus they've given him, given President Trump a lot of incentives as well, as far as investments, US investments into Vietnam and so on. So they gave up a lot, but they still got hit with 20%.
So in terms of, I think, Vietnam, now that's a different type of economy compared to Sri Lanka. Now, if you look at, I think the story of Vietnam is interesting, where if you took Vietnam's GDP, 90%, close to 90% of it comes from exports. So they're a very exposed economy. So I think given that they have 90% of their GDP being exported, they had to offer something. So I think many other countries out there also took tariffs off of US goods. Yes, like you said, there were investments that were promised. They, I think, gave full access to US to come into their market, sell the stuff that they want. So I think it's not easy, right? Because at the end of the day, despite, I think, initial thoughts were that Trump's tariffs were something that was put to scare the people out. But by the looks of it, right now, it doesn't seem that he's been joking around too much. So he is bringing it down a bit, but not as much as most countries would have expected. So, like I said before, I think even Vietnam is not very happy. They have a lot to offer, right? They've completely cut off the tariffs that they charge on US goods. Like I said before, it's on because they're so exposed, right? So they don't want to risk it, compared to, let's say, a country like Sri Lanka, who only has around 15-16% of our GDP in terms of exports. So even if you take a hit on that, that's still a small amount. But Vietnam taking a hit could be a major thing even for the economic growth rates, for the investments coming into their country. So that's, I think, that story there.
Right. So each country has a different story on this. Now, you spoke about what Sri Lanka can negotiate. And one thing, of course, is to bring down the tariffs on US products coming into Sri Lanka. But there's not much that we import from the US because we can't afford it.
True.
I mean, as simple as that. We buy from India, we buy from China. We just can't really afford a lot of US products. So that's, we're not going to suddenly start doubling our imports from the US. But you also spoke of West Texas Intermediate oil. Now, this is an interesting thing because the CPC buys the oil on a tender basis. there's been a lot of talk politically about, this minister getting a cut, that minister getting a cut, and so on. But in the end, there is a tender process, and that's how it's done. So we presume that once all these ministers' cuts are dealt with and thrown out the window at some point, that we are going to get the best deal out of our oil purchases. So now the purchases are here. We got Singaporean companies, Iran, Saudi Arabia, the Middle East basically. But what does it mean to try to purchase from, WTI? Which is a whole different ball game. Is it even feasible? Because it's one thing to go and say, well, we'll look into doing that, but would it have an impact on the price of fuel that Sri Lankans have to pay? Because if that is so, it's a no-no. Because, you can't have the price of diesel going up by 20 rupees or something like that. That's a disaster. So that's not something you can really negotiate. What are your thoughts on that?
So I think on the WTI oil itself, I think there is multiple factors to look into. Like one thing that you said is the price of it, right? So price of it compared to Brent. Right now in the market, prices look similar, but then it's not just the price, it's the cost to bring it down also.
Yes.
Because right now when we get oil from Asian markets, supposedly, let's say a 10-day period, we get our oil into the country. But let's say we're getting it from the US, now that's going to take a lot of time. So that's going to increase your shipping cost. That's going to increase your insurance that you pay for your shipping. So there is a bit of an issue there as well. So all of that will then factor into the ultimate price of this thing we bring in. And apart from the price itself, the next thing is, can we actually refine? Do we have the capacity? Do we have the technology out there to refine this different type of oil that we are bringing? Unless you're bringing the final petroleum itself, if you're bringing in the crude oil, can you refine that?
So right, because the crude oil in the US or different parts of the US, that's a different chemical composition. True. The sulfur and whatever chemicals which are in that oil, which have to be separated out and so on. So the oil you're getting from Iran is not the oil you'll get from Saudi Arabia. So. And our refineries are specialized. So you can't suddenly, load it with Iranian oil this month and then Texas oil the next month. It doesn't work that way. So there are issues there. Definitely. But what do we have in terms of offerings to negotiate? Because some countries now I think this morning, the announcement about South Korea's deal. South Korea has said in the deal that they will invest $350 billion in US projects, which Donald Trump is going to choose. So they've got that much money that they can invest. We don't. Plus another $100 billion of, I think, energy purchases from the US. So South Korea has that much money to negotiate with. We don't. We're a nation which went bankrupt. We're struggling to, save up $5 or $6 billion. But that's not going to impress Donald Trump, is it? I mean, he doesn't care about that kind of thing. He's America first.
I think so. In terms of, Sri Lanka itself, right? I think the story is a bit different because compared to most other economies out there, yes, they do have a lot to offer. So I think the only things that Sri Lanka can offer on one end is to reduce the tariffs that comes on US goods, which I think every other economy is also kind of offering. And apart from that, maybe a bit of increased exports by a bit more from the US, right? Certain things, maybe US is trying really hard to push in their agricultural commodities. I think that was a problem even with India, where US wanted to push in their wheat into Indian markets. But again, India didn't really want their farmer community getting affected, because at the end of the day, that's a big voter base that you don't want to mess with. So there were issues like that as well. I think They were trying to push it into Bangladesh. They were trying to push it into Vietnam as well. So maybe that's something that we can consider a bit, right? Maybe getting a few of maybe the agricultural commodities, things like that. But then something that you also have to look at is compared to most other countries that have struck a deal, Sri Lanka's trade deficit with the US is pretty small. So we are only looking at around a 2.5 billion, 2.6 billion of a trade deficit, where when you compare it with countries like Vietnam, let's say even China, who's not yet got a finalized deal, but they have huge deficits with the US. So on that end, maybe a point that Sri Lanka could actually make is that we are small, we are minute. So it's not going to affect the US much. There were different talks about the fact that on the service imports kind of things. Now, we do have a lot of service related imports from the US, because when you look at things like Netflix, things like Zoom, things like Microsoft Office, all of that works. But then I would not say that's really a standing point, because every other country does it as well. Right? If you look at
this is the point. I mean, Trump's the mathematical equation was wrong, because the U.S. Exports a lot more in services. I mean, each time you buy a laptop or a phone, you're using software, if not hardware. I mean, the hardware is made in China or wherever, but the software it belongs to a US company. It may be Apple or Microsoft or whoever. So we're paying a lot. I mean, Netflix, for example. I mean, the whole world is watching Netflix, perhaps half the world, and that money's going in there, and Trump doesn't, that's not it, right? Because, I mean, his point is he wants to bring jobs to his vote base. And Netflix, I mean, just because another billion people watch Netflix, it won't create a lot more jobs in the US. So he's taken that service side completely out, the services. He's focused on products alone. Now, is this, I mean, can that be negotiated at all? Have countries tried to tell him this, and has he just sort of brushed it aside?
I think a problem with the service thing is how you measure it. Because now, even if you look at, let's say, the fact that Sri Lanka pays, you do have certain regional hubs that this money goes into. So it's not really easy even for the US to track how much of money comes in for, let's say, Netflix from Sri Lanka, how much of money comes in, let's say, for Microsoft licenses. So there is a bit of an issue there as well. So I think, especially because of that fact, it's been kept out of negotiations. And also what Trump is focusing, he's talking about the goods itself. He's talking about the trade deficit. He's not talking about a good and service both together. So I think that's what he is looking at.
I think in terms of services, I mean, a common tactic would be for a US company to set up some kind of subsidiary offshore in a tax haven, set it up in Monaco or somewhere, and then our money gets funneled there, so it's not technically going back to the US. So, so Trump does have a point there. But let's look at some of the countries which have not got trade agreements. And it's quite staggering, because there are some major countries. Now China, for example, the negotiations are ongoing. This week, in Stockholm, Sweden, the negotiations went on. They're hopeful. There have been some promising statements coming out, but nothing concrete. What would now let's assume a proper deal is made with China. What would that do to the whole process?
I think the US-China story itself, I think it goes much beyond these tariffs itself. Now, if you look at supposedly US is world's biggest consumer and China is world's biggest producer out there. So the deal that these two countries get into will have an impact at the end of the day to all other economies, even for example Sri Lanka, who's lying in the middle of this. So in terms of, I think, US and China itself, right now, yes, there are some negotiations taking place, but I don't think they've got into a finalized deal yet. Now, supposedly, if there is no deal, the thing is where there is a 145% tariff on Chinese goods and there's a 125% tariff on US goods. Now, that's a remarkably high number. Now, at the end of the day, the parties who lose out will become also the consumers. It's not just the producers in the both countries, it's also the ultimate consumer. So even if you take US, they do rely heavily on China for certain raw materials. So all of that then starts affecting their industries also. So even though Trump's talking about reducing his deficits, creating more jobs, he might actually end up losing some jobs because certain inputs has to come from China. So with those kind of things, there is a bit of an impact. So right now, I think the most likely thing that's about to happen is this pause extending between the two countries, because 125 and 145% is not feasible. So most likely another 90-day pause until they get into some sort of agreement is what I feel is most likely.
Right. And I mean, anything that affects China is going to affect the whole world. But let's talk a little bit about India. Now, India, of course, took up that position that it has to protect its own industries, rightfully so. And of course, it got hit with a tariff, right? Now, from the Sri Lankan perspective, would this lead to a possible slowdown in the Indian economy? Because the Indian economy is driving the growth of South Asia, which is the fastest growing region in the world. And that's because of India. So if that slows down, you know, there is an effect on most of South Asia. So would that happen, or would it not be that significant?
I think there is a bit of a possibility as well. But in terms of, I think, the whole point of India being put at 25% is, I think, the fact that what Trump has also been saying is India buys a lot of oil from Russia. So he's not very happy about that fact. And the fact that India gets a lot of military equipment from Russia as well. So even if you look at Russia's biggest export market has been India currently for their oil. So I think that's one main reason that he's not been happy with. And in terms of even the 25% that he imposed, he says there is also penalties that can come into play for certain other reasons. So how much is this penalty? We also don't know. That there were talks about, I saw things on social media saying there could be 100% penalty. Now those are absurd numbers that you're looking at.
So we don't know.
We don't know. Yeah. So until things are finalized, what exactly the penalty is something you don't know. So if, let's say this 25% is what comes into effect, there could be a possible effect on India itself. But again, if you look at the region, so South Asian region as a whole, in terms of exports as a percentage of GDP, they're less exposed to it because India does have a huge domestic market. Yes, exports to US is a big factor there, but the domestic market is so big that, you know, even if these tariffs come into play, they still should be able to grow. Maybe not at the 6-7% levels that they did before, maybe a percent down, maybe at around, let's say, still 5.5% should still be possible numbers for a country like India. And I think as a region, even though we've not really got the best deals, even Sri Lanka, India, Bangladesh, we've not got the best deals, we're comparatively less exposed than the Southeast Asian regions. They might have better deals, they might have, let's say, 10% lesser tariffs than us, but they're so much exposed to this US market. So in return, they'll have to do a lot of investments into US. That's money going out from their country. They'll also have to give in exemptions for all the US related inputs. So I think the fact that, yes, South Asia can slow down a bit, but it's not going to be a pretty bad thing.
So you mentioned the additional tariffs that Trump has threatened on India because India has this relationship with Russia. Now, this is one of those weird conundrums because up to a few weeks ago, it was, I mean, if you talk about a love-hate relationship, you know, the Russian president and Trump seem to be getting along very well. And then all of a sudden, I think Trump was expecting a deal, a ceasefire in Ukraine, and that didn't happen. So Trump, I think, is exasperated with this. He has threatened high tariffs and economic sanctions on Russia, within the next 12 days. But now that has spilled over to India, because what he said is yesterday was that India buys so much oil from Russia and military equipment, and this is a punishment for that. But 3 weeks ago, he was perfectly fine with anyone saying Russia is great. So these little swings are, well, they're not so little, are they? And it's very difficult to predict.
Yeah, I think the swings, I think it's been a common thing since he's ever come in, right? I think it's not just with Russia itself. I think there were so many countries that he acts as if he's going to give them a good deal, but then ends up with something else. Now, even if you take with a country like India, there have been so much of rounds of negotiations. I think this is the fifth or sixth round that they've negotiated. So despite all that effort, Sri Lanka has only done, let's say, a round or two. So even with 5 rounds of negotiations, you're still ending up at 25. So I think it's really hard to read Trump's mind. So even if, let's say, any deal comes into play, like I said, it's not final, right? So even the deals that you have now with Vietnam, with Indonesia, with Japan, maybe a month down the line, the numbers could change. Maybe he might impose a penalty on top of it. Maybe he might put in a quota saying, look here, only the first 100 units of it is at this rate. The next set is tariffed at a higher rate. So things can actually change. That's how I think crazy his mind is. And that's what drives this uncertainty out there.
Right. We have a lot more to discuss, but let's take a short commercial break. I'm in conversation with Arshad Ismail of Frontier Research. Don't go away. We'll be right back.
Chamatkara Ratriya, an enchanting night awaits. A tribute to timeless legends, a celebration of melodies that echo through generations. A heartfelt homage to 2 icons who defined the soundscape of a nation. Victor Ratnayaka and Priya Suryasena. Their songs shaped our stories. Their voices touched our souls.
Join us for a night of unforgettable performances by Nalin Pereira, Samita Mudunkotua, Sanka Dine, Raini Charuka, Nadimal Pereira, Lakshita Suryasena, Hirushi Suryasena,
Chamatkara Ratriya, where legends live again. Musical direction by the brilliant Mahesh Nenipitiya. Every note will carry the soul of a legend. Mark your calendars for the 2nd of August from 6:30 p.m. onwards at the Muses College Auditorium. Tickets via theticketsministry.com. Don't miss the most heart-touching musical event of the year. Chamatkara Ratriya.
Are you the one with a talent the world has never seen? A visionary genius
GDP around $30,000 billions, 30,000, but in Sri Lankan context, we are just only 80 billions.
And one of the economic principle also say, with the trade, everybody better off.
Now, why he has reduced 44 to 30? That's what my point is all about, right? He's not playing kind of a trade game with us.
Now only the government, we are seeing that the provincial council election has completed and the people are appointed, but now only the infrastructure projects are being, the money is being deployed.
Face the Nation every Wednesday at 9:30 p.m. on TV1.
Welcome back to Face to Face. I am with Arshad Ismail, the Senior Research Lead at Frontier Research. Now, Arshad, before the break, you were talking about how unpredictable and sometimes crazy the mind of Donald Trump appears to be. There are many who say he knows exactly what he's doing, but I think a lot more people think, well, he doesn't know what he's doing. He's changing his mind all the time. But one factor I'd like to talk about is Brazil. Now, Brazil is a major trading partner of the US. It is a huge economy, largest in South America. So it's not a small player, and it exports a lot to the US. But it has been hit with 50%, which I think, apart from that Chinese 145, I think that's the second highest. And while the Chinese are able to negotiate, Brazil is not, because Trump has tied this tariff of 50% to the trial of the former president of Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro, who is on trial for trying to overthrow the present government of Brazil. So you would think that this is a Brazilian internal issue, but Bolsonaro happens to be a good friend of Donald Trump. So what he's basically saying is, you are going to try my friend for trying to overthrow the government. I'm going to charge you 50%. And he's even imposed sanctions on the judge who is in the case. So, so this is highly irregular. How do you deal with something like that? And in that backdrop, I'm wondering how our Sri Lankan negotiators are able to, keep their sanity in this whole affair.
I think, yeah. So I think this whole personal connections and, the relationships that he has also plays a big role here, right? So I think that is something that's very unpredictable, right? Because if you looked at certain trade deals that he's also got into with certain countries, do have a bit of a personal connection. He says he had a call over WhatsApp. He said he texted this guy over WhatsApp. He spoke to this president over WhatsApp, and had a chat. So, things like that have also kind of impacted. I think that's the same story with Brazil. And I think another reason maybe Trump is also a bit mad with Brazil is because of the fact that if you look at China, I remember seeing it a couple of days ago, China used to import soybeans from US. But now with all of these tariffs coming into play, they've stopped buying it from US and they've started buying it from Brazil. So, even things like that, small things that goes in, Trump starts to act on it. I think something that he's really trying to make is that trying to show how dominant US is, right? It's just, look here, even a small thing out there, I have the power to do something, right? If there's something that I don't like, I'm not going to keep quiet about it. I'm going to take some action. So even the small, minute personal things, right? Being on the good books with him will matter in this kind of an era going forward, even for Sri Lanka, right? Not to get into that bad books. I think so far we've not done anything bad, right? We've kept things very humble, very stable. Things should be okay.
Well, Sri Lanka is very good at staying neutral. Non-alignment is in our blood. I mean, back from the times of Mrs. Bandaranaike, we've tried to stay non-aligned. We did shift a bit towards China under the Rajapaksas, but now we've sort of been brought back to the non-aligned center by President AKD. So we don't have a black mark there. But now you mentioned that the relationship that a nation or a leader has with Trump matters. And we all thought that Prime Minister Narendra Modi has an excellent relationship with Donald Trump. They've met several times. Wonderful, press conferences given in the White House, where both of them have been very complimentary of each other and confident of the relationship. And then, bang! Yesterday, India gets hit with 25% plus. Well, you're going to get hit even more because you're a friend of Russia. So it's very unpredictable, isn't it? I mean, I would think from Prime Minister Modi's point of view, he has built that relationship with Trump, but then they got hit anyway. So it's very difficult, isn't it?
True. I think that's the whole. That's what makes it interesting at the end of the day as well, right? Because you might be his close friend out there, but if he doesn't like
interesting
something,
is an interesting term in this case. He's giving the world heart attacks, actually.
True.
Because I mean, for the last 3 or 4 months, this is the major news. Apart from, of course, that Middle Eastern war for about 2 weeks. This is the long-term impact is here. So how do you deal with this?
I think for someone like Sri Lanka, I think like we talked before, there's not a lot that we can actually offer. But then it's something that we'll have to look at in terms of the bigger picture. So out of, let's say, the exports from Sri Lanka, there is close to around 12-13 billion that Sri Lankan exports. Out of it, 3 billion goes to US. So even with all of these tariffs, you're not looking at a situation where all these 3 billion gets wiped off. So maybe, yes, there could be some sort of a hit, right? Maybe out of the 3 billion, you're looking at, let's say, a 0.5 billion, or maybe, let's say, 1 billion of a hit. That depends on who actually bears the cost. Is it the Sri Lankan domestic manufacturer who takes the hit out of it, or do you increase price and US consumer takes the hit out of it? So with all of those analyzing, putting those into play, yes, there might be some sort of hit in terms of the export side of it, right? So you'll have to deal with that, right? So I don't think you are able to increase exports in a situation like this, unless we definitely look at diversifying markets, right? I think EU is a good potential market out there, right? We're trying to, so far, I think temporarily we've sorted the GSP issue out there. There is a bit of a review coming up ahead as well. I think if things like that get sorted, maybe a bit of diversification can also actually help the country.
Right, it can help, but the US is such a huge market, so dominant for economically for over a century. So you can't replace that market. You can't ignore it. You have to sell most of your goods there because of the consumer spending habits of the Americans. I mean, our apparel industry has benefited immensely because Americans change clothes several times a year, whereas here in Asia we don't do that. So we might buy a few clothes for Aurudu or Christmas or whatever, but it's not an entire new wardrobe. So yes, the US is the big market, and you can't really replace it, can you? I mean, diversification sounds good on paper, but when you really get down to the numbers, you can't do much, can you?
Yeah, so I think in terms of the diversification also, I think that's something that Sri Lanka has been talking about in the last 20-30 years, right? If you look at central bank reports back in the 1990s, the recommendations on diversifying markets. And even right now, in 2025, we're still talking about diversification. So it's not easy, like you said, right? But again, what I think is, it's not that all of our exports to US will collapse. Right? We're sending around 3 billion. Right? Let's say we take $1 billion of a hit out of it. But it's not something that will happen immediately also, because it's not easy to replace, for example, US clothing manufacturers do have contracts with Sri Lankan local firms. So at least these contracts would be there for a year or two, maybe at least, let's say, until the end of this year. So those contracts will still continue. And even, let's say, a US manufacturer is now, let's say, looking at moving orders from Sri Lanka to Vietnam, but it's still uncertain, because what is to say again? Now, what if 2 months down the line, Trump comes in and adds in a more higher tariff on Vietnam? So making that decision even to move orders out of Sri Lanka is not a very easy decision to make. And even if you look at, let's say, Sri Lanka in terms of clothes, I think the basic polo t-shirts and all of it, I think that is something that could be replicable. But if you look at our activewear segment, if you look at the intimate wear that we send, I think the quality of it, the design of it, that's not something that you can easily replace as well. So that's why I'm thinking, even with all of this still being in place, even with all of these tariffs there, we're not going to take a huge hit out there with the tariffs.
Now, Arshad, how soon will we know the impact of this? Now, we're getting hit with 30%. Will we know in 1 week, 1 month, 3 months, what kind of hit this will make on our economy, or whether actually it's not so bad at all, right? Because it's very difficult to figure this out. I mean, I haven't seen any firm numbers behind it. There's nobody saying, okay, 30% and our economic growth, which is so much, is going to slow to so much. It's very difficult to tell. Mainly because the rest of the world is also getting hit with tariffs. So you really don't know what's going to happen. But how soon will we and the rest of the world know?
I think so. In terms of looking at this, like looking at this in a data point of view. Now, if you look at Sri Lanka's current account balance, so far we have data for the first 5 months. Now, Sri Lanka has recorded a current account surplus in this first 5 months, close to around a $1.3 billion. Now, if I'm to compare this, in 2022, the full year current account surplus was a 1.4 billion. In 23, the full year was around 1.2 billion. So right now, even in the first 5 months, the current account surplus has done even more than what it did last year. So the reasons behind that, yes, maybe right now, because Trump's tariffs have not really full come into play, the exports have remained stagnant. But what has really drove this is to compensate onto this export side of things, you had remittances growing. Remittances, you're looking at a number close around 650 million monthly coming in terms of dollars. Tourism has done well, right? In the first couple of months, tourism is doing well. It's coming close to the levels that it was in 2018, pre-crisis levels out there. So towards the end of the year, you're looking at another tourist peak season. You're looking at remittances continue to grow. So I think with all of that happening, right, even if, let's say, exports do take a small hit, I think the other buffers out there are keeping the Sri Lankan economy still going. Because despite all of this, you're still seeing a rupee stable at around 300. There's been a bit of volatility here and there, but rather flat. So that's proof that the Sri Lankan economy does have some sort of buffers to play around. Maybe if things get really, really bad, that is where it can take a hit. And even in terms of growth, I think Sri Lanka is well on track maybe to post a number similar to what it did last year. Last year was around 5%. Maybe this year could be something similar to that as well. So I'm not looking at a major hit right now, right? So it might take some time. Supposedly, let's say Sri Lanka is the only country at a disadvantage, maybe 2-3 years down the line. Now that is where I feel the impacts could really start hitting in. But so far in 25, we're doing pretty well.
Right. And of course, these tariffs are rather convoluted as well, because there are tariffs on certain sectors of the world's industries, which complicate matters a lot more. For example, you have copper, steel and aluminium, which are at, I think, 50% tariffs from tomorrow. And that means that even if a country has been given 10% or 15%, if these metals are a major export to the US from that country, they're going to get hit at 50% on that. Yeah. So it's not it's not black and white. This is rather a strange situation. Now, pharmaceuticals are going to be hit at 20% as well. So there are these sectors. So it's difficult to forecast anything, isn't it?
I think yes. I think there are specific sectors that Trump wants to create more jobs in the US, and aligning with that is where you have higher tariffs in terms of steel, aluminium, copper, pharmaceuticals, and all of that coming into play. But then the good news is that Sri Lanka doesn't really export a lot of that. Right. So we're not going to get a 50% on steel, copper, and aluminium. So what Sri Lanka mainly sends, I think 70% is textile, right? Which not all of it is easily replaceable, because the active pair that I spoke of before, it's not easy to replace. Right. And then we do send our tea, and most of it is the premium tea. It's not the usual blends that goes out there in the world. So again, not something that will be replaced in a day. Maybe in terms of Sri Lanka, the rubber side of things is a bit of a threat, but again, not something that Sri Lanka has to worry too much about in terms of those 50% numbers out there right now.
Right. But now these sectoral tariffs have been rather strange, because I saw in an article recently that now Donald Trump, he's trying to expand the automotive industry in the US. So obviously the tariffs on Japan and so on to make imports of vehicles more expensive. But then he goes and puts a 50% tariff on copper, steel, and aluminum, which goes into vehicles.
True.
So the US car maker, the automobile industry, suddenly finds its raw materials, which are coming from overseas, is that much more expensive. So the vehicles they make are going to be much more expensive. So this is all going to hit the US consumer. Is that a worry? Is it worrying that the US consumer is going to have to pay so much more, and therefore will have very little disposable income for clothes and so on? Again, I don't see any proper models of this even in the US. How badly will the consumers be affected?
So I think, talking of US consumer themselves, right, I think that's someone who's definitely going to take a hit, and that is a party that Trump has not really put a lot of effort into thinking, because at the end of the day, when you put on all of these tariffs, some of it does get passed on to the US consumer. So even if you take the apparel that we send in, could be a bit expensive now to this US consumer. So that's where you've seen US inflation still staying high. Now US, the target of inflation is around 2%, but the latest numbers are at 2.7. So with all of that happening, I think what Trump ultimately wanted was, yes, inflation would go up, but he would compensate that with low interest rates. But that is not happening. So Trump does really badly wants rates to go down, but the Federal Reserve is very
That's
adamant
why he's
about
having
that.
a big fight with the chairman of the Federal Reserve. Yes. And he's even trying to force him to quit, but that's not happening. Right. And my final question, because we are out of time. Now, this morning, Donald Trump announced that actually he signed the executive order for packages which are less than $800 in value, which were coming into the US. So anything that US consumers bought on eBay and all these online platforms, they were coming in basically duty-free, no tariff on it. But from, I think, the end of August, the regular tariffs are going to be levied. So if you've sent $500 worth of chocolates to your relative, or a US consumer has bought it online, that's going to be hit with the tariff for that particular country or that particular category, that sector. So that's going to drive up costs for the US consumer as well. But what is it going to do to companies and small timers in other countries who have been using this package method to sell to the US market with online sales?
Yeah, so I think even with all of this coming into play, right, I think the broader story is we're moving into a era with higher tariffs. Now, if you look at, let's say, even if you take an example of Sri Lanka back in the day, right, when we were buying, let's say, a liter of petrol at 140, prices went up to 300, people were complaining, people were shouting. But look at right now, we are okay with it, right? We're not very happy about it, but no one's complaining pumping petrol at 300 right now. So I think that is something that could also apply to US, right? So yes, even these small packages and all of it can start to get tariffed. Prices can be a bit higher. Maybe eventually these small firms might not pass the entire cost, maybe bit by bit, right? Maybe 5% initially, another 5%, let's say, in a few months. So eventually, I think those costs will also be passed on to the US consumer, or maybe even the firm might be able to come up with more productive methods to reduce their cost and thereby stay competitive. So I think overall, some initial disruption is where everything would happen. But let's say down the line, people would start getting used to it. The US consumer would now be used to that higher prices of maybe the chocolate that you were talking about. So that's where we're headed.
Right, and I'm afraid we're out of time. Of course, time will tell what the economic situation in Sri Lanka and the world will be. Hopefully, our government negotiators will negotiate a good deal, a better deal than the 30% we have right now. But we will, of course, bring you that news as soon as it comes. My thanks to my guest, Mr. Arshad Ismail, who is the Senior Research Lead at Frontier Research. Thank you very much, Arshad, and it's nice to have you here on the last day of low tariffs, and we'll all hope for the best.
Thank you, Harry.
And thank you to you at home for watching. Don't go away because the news is coming up next. Have a great evening.